Life and Adventures of Jack Engle, an Auto-Biography, in which the reader will find some familiar characters, by Walt Whitman. Read by Frank Blissett. Chapter 14. How the time rolled on! The summer was nearly over when the engagement was made to go and see Wigglesworth, as mentioned in Chapter 13, and I had been the better part of 2 years with Covert. I had passed Cape 21 in the meantime, and was now legally a man. Violet, the good soul, celebrated the event by a grand supper, to which came Tom Peterson and 7 or 8 of my more intimate cronies. And you may be sure that I did not forget Wigglesworth, although the latter was quite infirm, nor the progressive Nathaniel, nor Jack either. Wigglesworth, poor fellow, insisted upon repenting for his sins. But still he had been at the supper, and was persuaded into having a good time. I saw less of Inez than formerly, for she had taken up her permanent abode in half of Mrs. Fox's cottage at Hoboken, where she amused herself with a garden and Nancy's children, of whom she was fond. Still, I found time to make her an occasional visit, and whenever I went of a Sunday afternoon, which was my most frequent period of leisure, I was sure to bring home for Violet a huge bouquet, the source of which I made a great mystery of. And hence it came that Ephraim let off many jokes, at which nobody laughed more heartily than himself. My good parents, all this while, had jogged on happily together, neither poor nor rich, although Ephraim had found it necessary to increase and enlarge his business, and the old milk depot was now transformed into quite an extensive provision or grocery store, doing a good business and bringing to us all a very fair income. Violet continued to help her husband about the store, for she would have it so, and could never, she said, be contented unless she had something stirring and lively to employ her mind and body about. The excellent couple! How really and how simply they enjoyed life! With all their industry, they had a wise way of never getting excited, nor overworking themselves, nor crying over spilt milk, or, as Ephraim professionally used to say, sour milk. As for me, what little I had picked up of law was not of much account. The lapse of time had never reconciled me to the profession, although incidents and acquaintance and excitement, such as we in New York can easily meet with, diverted my attention from the despondency that had begun to come upon me when I had been a student for the first few weeks. Inez, too, had a share in rousing my gaiety, and the vivacity that always resides in young veins. My feelings toward the Spaniard could not be called by any means a profound love, at least so it seemed to me, for the only test I could imagine gave that supposition a denial. I imagined how I should feel if Inez were to leave the city and never return, and, much as I liked the girl, I felt that her departure wouldn't break my heart. So I have picked up some threads of my story that had fallen away, and find myself at the morning of the day where I was to go that night and see Wigglesworth. I had made an engagement to that effect, it will be remembered, 2 evenings before. This day was quite a day in my fortunes. First of all, a discovery. Could I mistake those affectionate eyes, and the nimble fingers that had tied the handkerchief around poor Bilchig's broken head? There, too, was the very same placid expression, and the goodness of heart, and the willingness to oblige. Covert had been kept home by illness, and Wigglesworth being also absent, an unusual thing for him, I was under the necessity of going up to the lawyer's house several times. One of these times, in the room where I had to wait a while, there was an old portrait of a lady that seemed to me like one I had seen in a dream. It was a Quakeress, with the neat cap and neckerchief, painted with the manner of looking at you, which gives such vividness to a really good portrait. A long, long time this picture riveted my attention, and then the truth came upon me like a flash of light. That elderly lady, was it any one in the world but the hospitable nurse and helper of myself and my poor wounded friend, in the early times of vagabondism? There could be no mistaking it. And now, like another flash, came upon my mind the looks of the young woman who had opened the door for me the night of the electioneering meeting, and whose face was then such a puzzle to me. She was the little girl of years before, remembered so well for a long time. Indeed, never forgotten. The little girl of the basement and the handkerchief. If there were really anything in those hints of Wigglesworth, this, too, must be the orphan to whom he alluded. The whole affair assumed an interest, and I determined to seize the first chance of making the acquaintance of the young Quakeress. I already knew that her name was Martha. Fortune favored me, for Martha came into the room with her sewing-basket, and telling me that Mr. Covert wished me to wait till he finished writing some papers which I was to take back to the office, she sat down, with one of those commonplace remarks about the weather, which are so often made in default of other conversational material. "Whose portrait is that?" I asked. "That is a lady thee has never seen," said Martha. "It is the portrait of Mrs. Covert, who died 3 years ago. I have reason to remember it. She was a second mother to me, and with her I passed, as a child, many happy years." "You are mistaken about my never having seen her, and it is a good likeness." The young woman looked up astonished, and without more ado, I gave a rapid sketch of the scene in the basement, and asked her if she did not remember it. Yes, she remembered it quite well. "And was it thy wounded head I bound?" "No, I was the other little loafer." "Ah, yes, I remember, there were 2 boys. Mrs. Covert and I often spoke of thee and thy friend afterward." Martha's countenance grew animated, and we talked of the good lady a while. She had been the owner of some little property, and that, advanced in life as she was, must have been her fascination to Covert. As Martha talked, the glow of feeling lit up her features, and she looked really beautiful. At the same time, there were traces of melancholy and lassitude about her, which I felt sorry to see. She avoided any reference to her father, except to tell me that her earliest childhood was passed with Mrs. Covert, both parents having died while she was but a year or two old, and of the latter she appeared to wish no inquiries about them. I saw that there was something connected with their history which made her withdraw from making any talk on the subject, for Martha's face, to a very remarkable degree, was an almost provoking index to her heart and nature. It seemed, after all, strangers that we were until this moment, that we were not strangers either, in fact, but old acquaintances. We fell at once into the friendly talk of persons who had that relation to each other. Martha told me that Covert was her guardian, that after her parents' death she was taken altogether to his house, where she had lived agreeably with the old lady, the only absence being that she spent 4 years at a girls' boarding school. She spoke feelingly of Mrs. Covert's death, which had been a great trial to her. That she was not happy here now, whatever might have been the case, I was convinced, from her demeanor and mode of answering my half-interrogation that way. For I had got so interested that I almost asked her. The door opened, and there, looking yellower than ever, stood Mr. Covert in his dressing-gown. He paused a moment, his eyes bent hard at us, and when he spoke there was more agitation, perhaps anger, in his tones than was usual for him. "What have thee two to do or say together?" Astonished by such abruptness, Martha dropped her work and looked at him in surprise. For my part, it was only because the man was so unmistakably ill that I refrained from giving him a very summary reply. "Go, Martha," he said, "and, young man, I tell thee, there is good reason why thee should not be so friendly here." Martha rose hurriedly, and, as she went out, I saw the unsuppressed tears falling rapidly from her eyes. "You are pleased to talk in a manner I cannot understand, sir," said I angrily. "Doubtless, doubtless," he answered, sitting down, for he seemed to grow faint. "But thee can at least understand that I do not wish any intimacy between Martha and thee." His eyes were bright with passion. Was it for me to bandy words with this sick man, and upon something it seemed as though we neither of us knew what we were talking about? I took the papers I had been waiting for, and left the house. I stopped by the way for an hour or more to see Tom Peterson. Tom was by trade a machinist, and, young as he was, had arrived at the station of foreman in a large, thrifty establishment, whose proprietors thought a good deal of him, and trusted him more than anyone else in their employ. Was it not that this manly trade had something to do in forming my friend's character? I had a notion that way, and a vague feeling of the story it was that had caused a good deal of my repugnance to the law. Tom had gone to his trade 8 years before, from his own choice, and he was now considered as thorough a workman as any in the land. He got good wages, and, as it was well understood that such a man as he could not be picked up everywhere, my friend was very independent, and demanded of the wealthy gentleman who hired him the same civility toward himself which he invariably used toward them. You see, I like to talk about Tom Peterson, and, reader, it would have done you good had you known him. He was such a fine specimen of a young American mechanic. I told my friend of my visit to Covert's house, and of Martha, and the lawyer's indignation. "He's a bad man," rejoined Tom bluntly, "and I tell you what, Jack, although it's none of my business, if I was you, I'd cut loose from him and his affairs as soon as possible. Rebecca Cellini is the sharpest woman to understand a fellow's character that I ever saw, and she despises him. Why, the fellow, as sanctified as he looks, is carnal enough, according to her story. She is mad at the sound of his name." "She likes you better," said I, waggishly. "Could she show a better sign of taste and judgment?" responded Tom. "But don't let us say anything more about Rebecca. I expect we shall quarrel soon, for the dear girl is very exacting." Tom's advice was not so much different from my own feelings as to make me think no further about it, and I had now begun to feel enough interested in Martha to want to know something more. Nathaniel and his dog stopped from their exercise. They had been commemorating the absence of all hands from business by running races up and down the walk in front. They stopped and came upstairs with me when I reached the office. "You return in good time, Don Cesar," said Nat, "for a messenger from the princess has just left this for you." He gave me a note. I thought the boy was fooling and tossed it back to him. But he grew serious and told me that it was brought but a moment before by a little darky who, in answer to Nat's inquisitiveness, could only say that it was given to him by a young lady, with a shilling to bring it down as addressed. I opened it and read as follows. "I write this immediately on your departure. This is no time to stand on ceremony, and I will follow the impulse of my heart. Alas, I have so few friends that it will not do for me to lose the chance of one, although I may seem immodest in writing so. Few? Where, indeed, have I any? I am unhappy here, to a degree which I will not undertake to narrate upon paper. I was much interested in your description of your adopted parents, Ephraim Foster and the good Violet. I wish to know them. I wish to speak with them. I have not time to continue my discordant note, but come at once to the point. Will you, for I must ask it, will you, unless you hear from me again, call for me tomorrow evening and show me to Foster's house and introduce me to him and his wife? You will then learn the reason of my singular request. M. At dinner-time I showed this note to Violet and prepared her for the visit. Her motherly heart always warmed toward those who had fallen in distress, and it was plain that poor Martha was suffering under troubles of no ordinary character. That was Chapter 14 of Life and Adventures of Jack Engle, an Autobiography, in which the reader will find some familiar characters, by Walt Whitman. Read by Frank Blissett.